So I'm Alan Tullar. I am part of the McGinley Domestic Relations Practice Group, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about cohabitation agreements, which are a unique document. It's a contract, if you will, between two people who live together who are not married. Pennsylvania law recognizes what we call prenuptial agreements, which would be agreements, contracts, if you will, entered into by two people who intend to and then get married. And then, if necessary, you could have something called a postnuptial agreement, which would also be a contract, a binding agreement between two people who are now married. But we frequently, and more frequently, are encountering situations where people are postponing marriage, deciding not to get married, living together unmarried, in which case there are no rights or obligations that are addressed by the divorce code. And so if those individuals want to establish their respective rights and obligations, primarily financial ones, and they want some protection, they'll need what we call a cohabitation agreement. A cohabitation agreement is simply a contract, because that's all it is, between two adults, spelling out their rights and responsibilities. Most of the time, what we see covered in cohabitation agreements are what will happen to the property in which they both reside. Does one of them own it? Do both of them own it? If the relationship ends, who has to move out? Under what circumstances? And are there monies to be paid out or distributed or shared between the two of them arising out of the value of that residence? We've also seen cohabitation agreements addressing how parties will share financial responsibilities while they live together under the same roof. If it's a house with a mortgage, who pays the mortgage payment? Do they share in the mortgage payment? What percentages? Utilities, maintenance, repairs, upkeep. And then, of course, again, at the end of the relationship, is there going to be some sort of calculation or formula by which recompense is made for contributions that were made or that should have been made during the relationship? I mentioned earlier, the question of who has to leave the residence. That's an important point. Regardless of whether or not the property is jointly owned by both people, if you live in a property long enough, you acquire tenancy rights. It can be very difficult to evict someone who's been living in a property. Cohabitation agreement can spell out exactly what those rights and responsibilities are. 30 days after the end of the relationship, with that defined as being triggered by usually something in writing delivered saying the relationship is over, you have 30 days. That can help enormously because eviction proceedings are complicated, they can be protracted, and having an enforceable cohabitation agreement allows you to seek to have it enforced as a contract between two people. Again, remember, this is not like a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement where you're going to go into court and ask a court to review it and enforce it in connection with a divorce. Instead, you're going to seek to enforce it as a standalone contract. So you can address as much or as little as you want in a cohabitation agreement, right down to who gets the pots and who gets the utensils and who gets the cat and who gets the dog. It can be very, very narrow. It can be very, very broad. It's also important to remember that if at some point those two individuals then decide that they are going to get married, that the cohabitation agreement that would have been binding and effective as a contract between two unmarried people is likely going to be of very little use once you're married. Once you're married, if you then split up, the divorce code is taking over. The cohabitation agreement does not just miraculously transform into a postnuptial agreement. You would have to then decide whether or not you wanted a prenuptial agreement that would be enforceable upon marriage, in which case you would need to get a new document. It may well be that many of the same points that were in the cohabitation agreement are now simply going to be recovered in your prenuptial agreement, but the intent and the wording of the document is going to be quite different. Unlike prenuptial agreements, which are tricky business and are often seen as romance killers, cohabitation agreements are a little less controversial. It's much more like a lease, right? It's a contract between housemates, between roommates, between partners, if you will, regardless of whether or not there's a romantic underpinning in the relationship. So, yeah, we're seeing more of those, and I expect that we'll see a lot more going forward.